Hi, I'm Jarrett Fuller. Welcome to Scratching the Surface. It probably wouldn't surprise you to find out that I follow a lot of design and architecture and art media. I subscribe to magazines and newsletters and follow blogs and Instagram accounts in an attempt to stay up to date with the latest news and discussions around design, but also to see how the producers of this media think about their work and how they think about the relationship to the disciplines. One publication that I followed for years and continues to be a daily read for me is The Architect's Newspaper. Founded in 2003 by William Menking and Diana Darling, the publication, which spans a website, a printed newspaper, as well as live events, is my go-to source for the latest news in and around architecture. But it's also an authority on the issues facing architects today. My guest on today's episode is the newspaper's executive editor, Jack Murphy, who joined the publication in 2022, first as managing editor before becoming the executive editor in April 2023, right as the Architect's Newspaper was celebrating its 20th anniversary. Jack is trained as an architect and worked in a variety of architecture offices before he went back to school in 2017 for his MArch at Rice University. And it was at Rice that writing and editing became a focus of his, where he worked as an editor for the school's journal PLAT and at the Rice Design Alliance, where he helped edit their publication Cite. I wanted to have Jack on the show to talk specifically about the Architect's Newspaper and its legacy, but also more generally about design media. Jack is in an interesting position, I think, as both a trained architect and an editor of a nationally distributed print publication. So we talk about the evolution of the Architect's Newspaper over its 20-year history and the value of continuing to publish in print. We talk about the intersection of news and criticism and journalism and how he thinks about cultivating voice and personality with his writers. But we also talk about the role of media in design discourse, the relationship between publishing and practice, and where design media should focus its attention in this new year. Speaking of media, did you know that we publish a monthly newsletter alongside this podcast where we round up design news, updates on previous guests, and new book recommendations? If you don't, you should sign up for that over on our website. We also have a paid tier that gets you bonus interviews each month and helps keep this show free for everyone. We're truly able to make Scratching the Surface because of listener support. So if you like what we do, I hope you join us over on our Substack to help us keep it going. You can support the show for just $5 a month or $50 a year. Thank you, as always, for listening. And here's my conversation with Jack Murphy. I want to go back to the beginning of the Architect's Newspaper in the first editor's note from William Menking and Kathy Lang Ho from November 10th, 2003, that sort of describes the ambitions for the magazine. It says that it's going to bring news big and small with a Catholic sensibility about what architects and designers might consider newsworthy: real estate, landscape, preservation, art, film, ecology, law. 20 years later, you step in, executive editor. How much of that is still there? How much of that described the magazine that you stepped into as executive editor? And then where do you think it evolved? Where do you think it's different? How has it changed in those 20 years?
Yeah, so I really take a lot of inspiration from, in particular, that editor's note and the flag that it plants in terms of the diversity of topics that the newspaper can cover. And I, return to early issues to understand the tone and the coverage there. What I understand and what I take from it is that there's a real sense of expertise that is put to the test. And at the same time, there's a sense of humor and a
Mm,
levity and a sense that, everything isn't exactly as it seems and that there are other things going on. The newspaper was founded with a model that in part came from Building Design, which is a publication that Bill Menking had written for previously. And so part of that model was like fast news, snappy headlines,
right.
and some of that is imported from the British media and their sensibility and kind of they're more intense than the US
Right.
at times. And I think when the publication began, it was very much for an audience of um, like-minded architects and
Mm,
people in New York City. And the audience for the publication, as I understand it, was, quite local. What's happening in New York after 9/11? How is the city moving forward and rebuilding? What is design culture at the beginning of the 21st century in this city? And to your question about how it's changed, the publication really now serves a much broader audience and is responsible for covering, the entire United States. And often we are looking at what's going on in Canada and increasingly what's going on in Mexico and around the world. And so I feel like there's a much um, broader public
mhm.
that read the publication, that follow what we're doing, and that comes with a sense of responsibility for me. It's not just a publication for a very local and particular architectural audience. It really serves kind of continental readers, and that's important for me as someone who joined the publication living elsewhere, not being in New York, and wanting to have coverage that kind of serves all of these different markets. Another thing you should note about the publication is that it was founded with the idea that it's regional, and so over time there were regional print versions of the newspaper. So some of the stories would be swapped out. There was a Midwest editor, there was a
Oh,
West Coast editor who was based in Los Angeles. And so there was a moment in its history where they were producing regional print publications, and I think that ceased in, I want to say, 2017 or 2018, and now it's a single print issue.
I want to talk more about the sort of the mandate that you were talking about and the way you're thinking about audience. But I have one other question first that as a longtime reader feels like a shift, and maybe I'm kind of pulling at threads and picking at words a little bit. In that intro editor's note, I'm struck by the use of the word news, big and small, and then about what architects and designers might consider newsworthy. Obviously, it's in the name, newspaper, but and I think news is still a big part of it. You are where I get a lot of my architecture news, but in some ways that word feels limiting to me. I think there's a lot more criticism, a lot more analysis, a lot more kind of profiling and storytelling. A, would you agree with that? And B, how do you think about how that fits into this larger editorial purview that you're talking about?
Well, first of all, I think we remain a newspaper in the sense that we're really reliant on uh, announcements and new developments and new information that we're transmitting to our readers. That's a kind of key component of what we do and what our editors write every day and which shows up in our newsletters. But I take the other sections of the newspaper really seriously in terms
Mm-hmm.
of the culture or the business sections or the book reviews or things like that. I would identify that impulse to review and to critique and to, with carrot or stick, kind of encourage uh, a wider sensibility has been there for a while. I'm also really interested in this expanded set of content that we can provide. And so you may have seen that show up in, interviews or exhibition reviews, book reviews. We've been on a kick lately about architecture and television. So even thinking about the media itself and how we reflect on that condition. And so there is a really wide range of content that I am interested in and that we're looking at. If you see the publication in print, there are a lot of different types of articles from, 100 words about a new project commission to 1,200
Yeah.
words about a new book. And so, or a review of a book. And so that to me keeps it really interesting. And we work quickly across a lot of different types of content and with a wide range of writers to provide a really diverse set of pieces that we publish. Um, so I would see that as being part of what the newspaper has done um, for a while, but I think some of it also is kind of uh, perhaps my sensibility about what we should cover or
Yeah.
what's interesting, or even tonally, how we engage with content.
I think this is true, what I'm about to say. I'm not totally sure, but I think this is true. I think that the Architect's newspaper is the only independently owned, nationally distributed architecture publication. We could actually say independently owned and woman owned by Diana Darling, the co-founder. It is a publication that's for architects. In that sense, it's sort of this trade publication. And being the only one doing that, being the only independently owned, nationally distributed publication, I'm wondering what that means for your editorial purview, how you think about your position within the architecture world or worlds. And then the sort of the sub question or the question after that is, how does that change how you think about your audience? Who is your audience? How do you think about them as it relates to this kind of editorial direction?
I do think that statement about being the only independently owned architecture media company definitely is true about print. And I think, it's a real success story that, through over 20 years of work, the company has flourished and continued to exist. The newspaper is, one of two print publications that we make. There's also A&N Interior, which is a design magazine, and we do events in a number of different formats, most prominently a facades conference around
Mm-hmm.
the country. Um, for me, at least, there's a high degree of responsibility, I feel, in like wanting to be a place that transmits like accurate and timely news. I think there are a lot of stories that are really uplifting and really important, both in terms of design success, in terms of the profiles of a diverse range of architects. And I'm looking for stories, and I'm interested in stories that might not be told in other publications.
Yeah.
There are a lot of places, for example, where you can see images of beautiful projects
Yeah.
displayed on the internet and in print. And the charge for me of the newspaper is to dig under the surface of those images to figure out how the project was delivered, to critique its existence, good or bad, and to be a place for discourse among working professionals. So yeah.
I want to talk about like sort of how you arrived at that perspective on what you should be doing and talk about it through the lens of your trajectory, how you got into all of this. And so you studied architecture at MIT. You graduated in 2010, I think. Is that right?
That's right.
And then you worked in a variety of architecture offices, and then decided to go back to school to get your master's in architecture at Rice that you started in 2017. And it seems like your time at Rice is where your development in writing and editing really started. It seems most specifically at PLAT, which is the independent architecture journal run by the architecture students there. How did you get involved in that? How did you get involved in writing? Had you done much writing before this? Tell me about sort of what was happening at Rice that started this journey for you.
I think the interest for me in reading and writing actually predates my interest in architecture,
Mm,
in the sense that even growing up, I was a really voracious reader and did things like edit the high school newspaper at the Math and Science Academy in Texas, where I went to school as a high school student. And even during my undergraduate degree at MIT, I was taking writing classes outside the School of Architecture. And it was something that was, I think, something that I've long been interested in. Feel like I have a very synthetic, wide-ranging set of creative interests in like music, in writing, in design. And even after my undergraduate degree, when I was working as a designer in an architecture office, I started doing freelance writing for a blog and for Texas Architect, the AIA magazine in Texas. And what I was really interested in working on writing alongside design is that architecture takes a very long time. Architecture is very expensive.
yeah.
Architecture inevitably requires the labor and participation of many parties. And writing was a very fast, very personal exercise where I could do research, speak to subjects, and have a kind of creative piece
Hmm.
fairly quickly. And even as a young architect, it was really useful to me because as a designer, you're in one office, you're learning one way of doing things. And so writing for me was in part an escape pod where I could be in
Right.
dialogue and learn from a lot of different people through the interviewing process, through the reviewing and writing process, and it really helped me expand my sense of what architects can do and different ways that you can practice. When I got to Rice, that is really a time when my sense of what I could do and how I could contribute to design culture and architecture
Mm,
culture changed. And during that degree, as you mentioned, I was a co-editor for PLAT, working on issues 7.5 and 8.0. I assisted a professor at Rice, Troy Sham, with a book that he was working on,
okay.
and again took classes outside the architecture school to work on writing. And so during that degree, which in part, I had great mentors along the way. Sarah Whiting was the dean when I joined
Right.
at Rice, and she recruited me there, and other professors, including Rachel Geiser, who ended up being my thesis advisor, um, were academics who showed me how reading, writing, editing can be an active way to shape architecture culture. And so it was true that, and it remains true that after that degree was really when I went into full-time editorial work.
I want to stay in that moment for a second and maybe a little bit before. I'm curious, before you get to Rice, you're working as a designer in these architecture offices. You're doing some writing on the side. You describe it as sort of an escape pod from the architecture office a little bit. did those things talk to each other at all? Was the writing that you were doing, the freelance writing you were doing, was that making its way into sitting in that architecture office or being in that architecture office? Was that, how did that shape the types of things you wanted to write about or the types of people you wanted to talk to and interview and research? How did those start to be in dialogue with each other, or were they in dialogue at all?
They were definitely in dialogue. You know, part of the early writing work that I did for Texas Architect was, talking to practitioners who were working in the same city. So I was getting to know Austin more and more deeply through dialogue and writing and involvement with the AIA. It meant that I was, traveling around the state to look at buildings and getting to see how were built there. Um, and I definitely, I feel fortunate uh, to have, had the support of, um, Burton Baldridge, who is the architect I worked for 4 years in Austin. There were moments where it did overlap, socially in terms of who I was covering or writing about.
Mm,
There was an incident where something I actually wrote for the newspaper, which was somewhat critical, caused one of the subjects of the story to email my boss to complain about an article I had written outside of the office.
right.
There were definitely overlaps, and it was a really kind of potent moment when you're kind of learning a field, when you're learning the tools, when you're learning professionally how it works after exiting uh, academic environment, which is really nothing like how the profession often
Right.
is experienced. And for me as a young person, having a wide range of creative interests, finding my way in how to explore and work on and pursue those, it was a really um, yeah, robust and exciting time.
Your story sounds very similar to my own story. I feel like it's only much later that I realized that I was interested in writing and reading before design. I had always sort of thought it was the opposite, but it's very clear to me now that the writing side of this all came first. And I think about this in my own work a lot, and I've talked to many people on the show about this. I'm curious how studying architecture has that. Do you think that shaped how you approach writing at all, or was there anything from the actual sort of architecture education that has influenced your writing process, how you write? Uh, Obviously you're writing about architecture, but sort of the way you structure and approach your stories. Is there any transference that's happened there?
I think one thing is that I did write as required for history and theory
Yeah.
courses and things like that. And I did read every assignment, of course, diligently. But I think it set me up to really think about writing as one format among many in which design can be advanced. And what I mean by
uh,
that is not as writing being the sole format through which an idea is conveyed, but the power of writing set against imagery or photography as a way to convey an idea.
mm,
One of the things that I really felt for a time was that there was a lot of writing about architecture that wasn't that exciting
yeah.
and that it wasn't that dynamic, even in terms of its construction or vocabulary or even sense of humor. And so when I found um, texts and critics and people who I could even perceive through the text, not having met them before,
Yeah.
that there was a liveliness and a sense of humanity. That was really exciting to me, and I really gravitated towards moments where I could really see that observation and that attention being a really central part of the text. So when I found pieces like that, I got really excited about it. And I guess part of the reason why I wanted to go into editorial work is that I really believe that we need better writing, more convincing media
Yeah.
about the environment. And I feel very motivated to be a part of how that is produced and to connect thinking about architecture to thinking about the rest of one's life and thinking about the city and the politics and material
Yeah.
condition of that structure, how architecture is actually made. One of the places that I think I'm really interested in is understanding like what sets the limits of where architecture is possible, how much money is available, what sites are available, what is even the space where design is possible, and how much design, and how can we have better deployments of it. And so that edge condition of how can we even have more architecture is something that I think about a lot.
I want to go back. I want to stay on that thread, but I want to go back to something that you said right before that for a second, because I really relate to this idea of feeling like you couldn't connect to a lot of architecture writing, or that it wasn't scintillating in the way that some other types of writing are. I think about this all the time in my world of design, and I think some of this does happen in architecture too. That there are very clear, lucid design and architecture writers. There are fewer design and architecture writers that really know how to work the prose, that really know how, that are really thinking about sort of rhythm and texture and voice and tone and humor. And, I look at my bookshelves of like the writers who I really turn to when I need to like reinvigorate my own prose, and none of them come from architecture and design. That's not to say that they don't exist, but they're there's much less of them. I'm wondering how you think about that now as an editor. How do you encourage voice? How do we as media encourage thinking about writing not just as the transmission of ideas or the relaying of facts, but as an art form of its own? I like the way you were talking about it as like sort of thinking about buildings. I I often think about, the way graphic designers look at the kerning of the text or the relationship to type size, or whatever, the exact color when it hits the page. Why do we not think about that level of detail when we're writing? Also, you know what I mean? How do you think about that when you're editing people, when you're commissioning stories, when, thinking about this as being not just a story, but beautiful prose also?
That's a hard question. I
Sorry, that was like a rant that I think
That's okay.
I needed somebody to talk about this with for a
I'm
while.
here for you. Yeah. I mean, so part of that for me is like at the same time, I'll go back for 1 second while I'm thinking about the answer to this
Okay.
question. Uh, at the same time, I was, in school and like reading for that and thinking there. I mean, I was also a regular reader of fiction of
Mhm.
lots of different types of writing. And, I was even, I'm of an age that I was reading about the profession of architecture on the internet for a
Right,
long time,
right.
uh, reading the forums of Archinect and being, making a Tumblr to kind of find things
Yeah,
that I thought were
yeah,
aesthetically pleasing,
yeah.
right?
We're the same. Yeah,
Yeah, so that internet sensibility also, and you thinking about the internet as an additional repository of how we learn things and the destabilizing, flattening,
hmm,
exciting kind of permutations and collisions that it encourages. That was a part of is a part of my intellectual exploration. It's a part of how
Yeah.
my brain has grown up.
I credit all my sort of intellectual growth as just blogs, just reading
Yeah.
blogs as a teenager. I 100% relate to that.
Yeah. But so there's that, which means that there, for me at least, there's a very, fairly rich
Yeah.
media diet of reading lots of different kinds of writing, from amateur blogs to, theory papers to reviews to comments on websites. And so that's part of it. I think for me, I one part of the answer is that, there's a certain set of stories that we produce that need to be really straightforward, right? Here's the
Mhm.
news. We're going to deliver the news in a clear way with, perhaps, some background information you didn't know, or, a joke here and there. That's part of the flavor of the newspaper. But there are often moments, and I do, encourage people to uh, write about things that are, personally significant to them, that use the I pronoun, right, to
Mhm.
include yourself in the text.
Yeah.
Um, and, when we have the opportunity to do so, we do kind of edit with the mindset to kind of bring in more texture and more description. One thing I really like about when writing is successful to me, I think I really respond to even just the texture of language and the rhythm of sentence arrangement. And those are qualities that writing can provide that photography cannot provide.
Mhm.
The way that you, certainly as a writer, the way that you translate what you're seeing, feeling, hearing, smelling
Yeah.
into language, that's a
Yeah.
real skill that develops over time. And when I have the real pleasure of commissioning and working with writers who are able to do that, it's really fun. And it, I think, brings a sense of authenticity and lived experience into text that is useful. I'm not going to say that the piece all of a sudden becomes about only one's perception,
Right.
right? So there is a balancing there of the subject and the pursuit of an informed opinion about a new building or about a, book or exhibition or what
Yeah.
have you. But to have a type of media that feels really human, that feels broadly accessible, both to architects, but perhaps even to, a curious general public that might find us on the internet through Google
Mhm.
search. That to me is important, that material is written in a way that can be at least um, accessed by um, by by a slightly wider range of people. I'm not going to say we're writing for the entire general public, but I would like to think that we're writing first for architects and then secondarily for an interested wider public.
Uh, this raises questions for me about media and formats generally. And you already mentioned blogs and forums and Tumblrs. And um, it strikes me that most of the way I consume the Architect's newspaper is through the website. But as you mentioned, you have, it is primarily a print publication. You do 7 print issues a year. And when you were with PLAT, that was in school, that was a print publication. You also worked for a time on Cite, which was the Rice Design Alliance's publication. And these are all print based media. And I'm wondering how you think about printed publishing in a world that is primarily digital. What value do we get from something that's bound and on paper versus something that we read on screen? How does that change how you think about what you are publishing and how you are publishing?
Printing things out means that you have to be careful with what you're doing, but also what you're producing has, you need to be kind of confident that what you're producing has enough value
Mm,
that it can last. With the newspaper in particular, this is something we talk about regularly because anything that's written that we plan and produce to be put in the newspaper is at least 2 weeks old from the time the text is filed until
yeah,
someone could read it in print. And so that delay means that any of the news that we might plan to announce is there's a shift there what in when people are encountering this
yeah,
information. And what that means for me as an editor is that I want the print publication to be a broader resource. It's not just the latest hits or most immediate news, but that we have a place to think thoughtfully about feature stories, to have resources for practicing architects to go back
yeah.
to help reviews that you might encounter or deal with in multiple settings or over a series of weeks. It's changed a bit about how we think about how we use the print. So it also means that there's things that we push ahead with online immediately, and there are things that
Right.
we plan for print and produce particularly for print. And so that split is something that we're, as editors and in our newsroom in New York, something that we're constantly talking about is, what do we do with the story? How do we engage with it? Um, what could we put in the print issue? What do we need to, you know,
Hmm.
run online first? And how do we feed both formats for the publication? Um, so that's a constant conversation. The good thing that one of the things I'm thankful for working at the newspaper is that there's a real commitment to print. We're committed to print, and it's kind of a key part of how we reach our audience. And so that's something that is, again, nice about working here.
I'm curious how you think about the what is the role of media within the profession or within the industry. And the reason that I ask that is I'm thinking about what we were talking about earlier about when you're sort of reporting on things that are happening, when you are uh, breaking news, you're telling news stories, but then there's also this kind of critical piece where you are critiquing the industry. I'm also thinking about what we were talking about earlier about you sort of being involved in reading and writing at every level. And so you read the fiction, you read the academic discourse, you read the forums. And it seems to me that media is a place that can sort of sit between all of those. And I'm wondering how much you think about how much are we responding to things that we see in the industry versus how much are we trying to set an agenda that we think the industry and the profession should be talking about and thinking about, and then your position within that and how you sort of how you think about that, both specifically for you, but also just sort of architecture and design media at large.
I think one of the aphorisms I've written for myself that I go back to in my brain is that architecture exists between and among formats.
Mm,
So what that means for me is that if you see a building outside, somehow that's not fully architecture. If you see a plan drawing of a building that's that architects make, uh, that's a piece of architecture. If you
mm,
see a 3D model, if you see a rendering, if you see a contract, if you see a book or a
right.
magazine or a photograph, there's a plethora of formats in which an architectural expression can be captured. And this proves to be a really frustrating reality because the slipperiness means that it's never quite enough to get the full story.
Right.
And so that realization means that nearly all of what we know about architecture is is mediated,
Hmm.
arrives to us from media,
Hmm.
meaning that we can't go see every building or visit
Hmm.
the archive to see every drawing. And so it becomes an epistemological question of how do we know what we know about architecture? We experience it through books, we experience it through um, lectures, we experience it through film, through writing, through magazines, through Instagram, through TikTok, through Yelp reviews, right?
Yeah.
There's a wide range of formats that we use to put together to assemble an idea of what an architect does, or is this building good, or what is this building actually like, or does it work? And so the responsibility then, um, perhaps of architectural media, is to be uh, very cognizant of that process of assembly and to try to package architectural knowledge, whether it's news or reviews, in a way that feels honest and accurate and gives someone real insight into what's going on.
Yeah.
Um, One of the major, I think, points to know about how we learn about architecture today is that so much of what we see is produced, directly by the people that are making the projects, right? If you go
Yeah.
to really great repositories like ArcDaily, you can really quickly understand a lot about a particular building or project. But that that way of presenting a project or that piece of media might miss other parts of the story. It might miss the story of the fraught relationship with its local community. It might miss the budget overruns. It might miss the terrible carbon story. It might miss even how it actually appears because the photography has been edited enough that it looks so perfect and beautiful. And so I think part of what think the one charge for an architecture editor, and perhaps, a charge for myself is how can we tell more realistic, more human, fuller stories about the buildings that architects lead and what it's like to be an architect in working in today's society. And so, you know, I I think that act of assembly and putting things together and saying, what if we go for this or we need to talk about that is really important. And you brought this up in your question, but part of the balancing act is what's happening, like what are the big things that are finishing, or what are people talking about? What are people talking about versus what is my agenda as an editor? So part of my agenda as an editor is I want to be a participant in delivering richer, more human stories. I want to focus on the climate crisis and all of the ways that architects are have been participants in the arrival of the climate crisis and how architects can be uh, active in finding solutions or responses to it. I think I'm very interested in uh, questions of housing and home, and in a country where housing has been underbuilt for the last 50 years, like how do we deal with that in our cities, and how does that shape even the experience of young people uh, making their way in the world and the difficulties that produces. And I'm really interested in the questions of practice, ethics, and diversity, and how we broaden our understandings of who architects are, how they work, and who their clients are. And so these are like broad ideas that kind of animate coverage that we work on at the newspaper, and that I'm kind of personally interested in seeing more of in architecture media.
I like what you're saying about so much of our experience of architecture being mediated. We don't always get the full story when we're getting these highly produced kind of PR driven narratives. and maybe this is the same answer to what you're personally interested in, but are there parts of that story that you feel like we can do a better job telling? Are there parts of the architectural process that we just as an industry overlook, we don't talk about enough, that should be foregrounded more than they are?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about this.
Okay.
One of the points that I'll make um, is that before beginning on this journey and doing this work, I didn't understand the way in which PR kind of lenses and shapes um, the media
Yeah.
generally, and architecture in particular. And so we're living in a particular moment where media business models are changing slash falling apart, and where there's increasingly so many good stories out there and fewer places to tell the stories. Um, I think the ratio, I was looking this up earlier, but I think right now the ratio of PR professional to journalist in the United States is about 6 to 1. And it used to be closer in the 1980s, closer to 1 to 1. And so I think that that creates a media ecosystem where there are a lot of stories, a lot of them quite good. And the problem becomes how can we assign them? How do we have the budget to cover enough of these? And who will write them? And I don't mention that to say that it's super problematic. Like you know,
Right.
there are a lot of great stories that arrive and that are presented really well through that method, and the newspaper benefits from it. Nearly every publication benefits from it. But I think it's something that I think about in terms of um, questioning myself as to like what stories get told
Yeah.
and what stories don't get told, and who is covered and who is not covered. Um, so I think that's a really interesting kind of note to think about, is that the way that related industry really intersects with architecture and shapes the kind of coverage that can happen. I think the other question that you had was about like what kind of stories do I want to tell, or what are we missing, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
what do I want to hear about? Um, and I have a lot of answers to that because I think I'm really interested in deeper understandings of the kinds of teams that
Mm,
join together and shape how buildings are produced. So I think a better and more kind of anthropological understanding of the relationships between
yeah.
architects and their related and the team professionals is really interesting. Um, when you start digging and asking, well, why is it like this, or why did you do this with the facade, or why did the rendering what changed, or why does it look like this? You get into questions of well, the supplier could only do this, or they had this better option that we went with. And it quickly becomes a story at times about the negotiation
Yeah.
and kind of space of potential that happens within these collaborations. And so having a richer understanding of how that works,
Yeah.
it's knowledge that architects have, and when you talk to them, they'll say, "Oh, we've been working with this structural engineer for decades, and they are so great, and this is why everything." That's kind of professional knowledge, but I think having a richer understanding of that exchange is really great. Um, I think stories about where materials come from
Mm,
are really interesting, and the types of coverage and people that are out there doing the research about how mining goes on, and what the kind of transport footprints and carbon footprints for building materials
Yeah.
looks like. I think even architects being um, involved with the politics of the construction site and the relationship to construction is a really interesting, rich trajectory. Um, Architects for a while historically distanced themselves from the job site and from the real questions and problems of construction. And so it's been really rewarding and encouraging to see academics and architects really delving into that question of labor. So such intelligence. I'm really inspired by that. Um, yeah, and then also kind of understanding broadly how we continue to diversify architectural history and what we know about the origins and influences of how ideas and styles and even architects themselves moved or circulated around the planet, and having a more kind of a less Eurocentric
Yeah.
awareness is something that's ongoing and something that's quite important to broadening um, our sense of history and our support for non-white architects in the profession. So that's something that I think about a lot as well as a white man architect.
It strikes me that so much of this conversation that we're having is about the relationship between media and the profession, between the act of writing and the act of designing. And I want to try to tie all of this together by talking about a specific project that you worked on, your thesis project when you were at Rice. You were working on this spring 2020 as the lockdowns happened. Your thesis was called Department of Wellness, and in that you created a new fictional federal department and then did a speculative remodel of a Marcel Breuer building for this new federal department. Key to this project was a fictional short story that you wrote because everything was locked down and you couldn't leave your apartment. And that project seems to be a really clear way to bring writing and design together in your own work. Can you just briefly describe that project and what you were trying to do? And then what I'm really interested in is what you learned from that that has shaped the work you've done since, the way you started to see writing as a tool in your design process and writing as a way to embody these buildings in a different way.
Yeah, so as mentioned, yeah, my thesis project uh, was the proposal for this new department. And as a lot of thesis students do, there is a kind of search for what are the parameters of my project? How do I tell the story? What do I produce to communicate what I'm doing? And even what is the kind of scope of my design project? A lot of thesis material really focuses on that. And yeah, as you mentioned, I was working on this project as the lockdowns and kind of arrival of the pandemic
Yeah.
happened. And what I saw happen was the removal of access to, printers and wood shops and studio space. And I was left with, my brain and my laptop. And so what I did as really as a mo as a I mean, in hindsight, it was again a kind of survival strategy, which
Yeah.
is uh, how do I um, how do I present this big idea? And
Mm.
the building project that I had taken on was a very, very large building in, the floor plates were, enormous, 500,000 square feet
Yeah.
on each floor. And so the way that I moved through that project, or I kind of found my way forward, was I wrote a short story about a fictional character who leaves his, job, or leaves the building where he works in DC, walks across
Mm,
the hall, and moves through the spaces of this facility. And so with that story, um, I was able to establish a route through the building
mm,
that would give me the scenes and kind of excuses and cues to figure out what I needed to draw and make renderings of to like tell the story of the
yeah.
project. And that was really essential for me because it was a real struggle, as you might be able to imagine, to kind of like really focus on this
Yeah.
at a moment of, national and international difficulty. And so the way that I kind of delivered the project was I had a, series of drawings, renderings, images that accompanied the short story that I
Mm,
wrote. And so the thesis presentation on Zoom was me reading the story and the pictures proceeding with me just advancing the slides.
mm,
And so this taught me, this was a real hinge for me because it was really the first time I had used writing, previously to organize my thoughts about what do I say during this presentation or what is my argument. But this is a real key moment for me where writing became a mode of world making and
mm,
shaping and staging design. And so it taught me a number of things also that, or revealed a number of things to me that I have continued to use, which is that, the power of narrative, right?
yeah.
To the strength, the attitude that's needed to kind of move through design work, the sense of optimism that really powers um, when architecture is at its best, and even the value of a sense of humor, because the story had, kind of funny moments and like little asides to it. And after that, after working on that thesis project, I was fortunate enough to then be able to begin uh, working on Cite, which is the Architecture and Design Review of Houston, and that moment was really my entry into full-time work
Mm,
as an editor, and kind of set me on the trajectory that I am now on now. And so even, some of the ideas about like, what do I want architecture media to be like?
yeah.
Those are, if you, those I would like to believe are embedded in that story and in the, yeah, mix of humility and curiosity and vibrance that really makes architecture special and meaningful to me.
That's exactly why I wanted to end with you talking about this project, because it sort of weirdly seemed like it embodied everything that we've been talking about so far, both the ambition of architecture, the ambition of media, the relationship between them, the different ways we experience buildings. It's all there in that project. And I think you said it really well when you said it sort of, speaks to your love of all of this. This was such a great conversation, Jack. Thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
That was my conversation with the Architects Newspaper's Jack Murphy. It was recorded on November 15th, 2024. Our theme music is by Jeremiah Chu. The show is and always will be free thanks to the generosity of listeners like you. If you like what we're doing, I hope you consider supporting us and get some bonus content each month. You can follow us across social media at Surface Podcasts, and you can listen to all of our previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts and at our website, scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.